like to introduce Suresh Krishnan, presenting the summary and next steps from the IAB NEMOPS workshop. Suresh works as a distinguished engineer in the Strategy, Incubation, and Applications Group at Cisco. He's serving as a member of the Internet Architecture Board, the IAB. It's a pleasure to have him presenting today. Welcome to NANOG, Suresh. And with that, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Phil, and welcome all. So we had a presentation, the IAB, the IESG members like Warren here, along with other people, had a presentation at the last NANOG meeting in Toronto, talking about this workshop we're going to have about network management operations, how we go forward with that. And this is follow-up to that to kind of show what happened at the workshop and how we plan to go about addressing the issues that were brought up and so on. So just a quick summary of the IAB. I think the IAB does long-range technical direction for the IETF and the internet community as a whole. And part of the work of the IAB is to run workshops to look at some of the challenges that are there, look at emerging technologies and create input for further work in the IETF, in standardization or for further research in the IRTF. So pretty much is to look at longer term issues and potentially run programs to focus on longer term issues. So about 20 or so years ago, everything was running on SNMP, and the IAB decided to run a workshop to kind of figure out what are the issues that were facing network management at the time. And there was a big roadshow. They went to many of the operator communities. They went to NANOG. They went to RIPE to get the European perspective, and also the USNICS LISA conference that is I think defunct right now. And a lot of the inputs were the configuration management stuff was really not very usable, and it's pretty complex as well. And in 2002, there was an IAB workshop that was held, and it was held in Reston, and it led to a lot of things. And this is a word cloud, it kind of talked about all the things that came out of it. And so I think the big things that came out of it is what led to the creation of NetConf, ResConf, and Yang, and so on, as a replacement for SNMP-based solutions for configuration and monitoring. And so since we had quite a bit of time after all these standards and protocols were defined, the IAB wanted to see how things are going in the marketplace, right? Are the things working well? Are the things not working well? Is there any issues that have been solved? Issues that are still open? And so we decided to do another workshop 22 years later to see how the solutions are working in the industry itself. And this workshop happened in December. It's a virtual online workshop with quite varied participation from multiple operators, from multiple geographies. So we had people from the NANOG area, the RIPE area, the LACNIC area, and also the APNIC area. So there's quite a bit of participation from there, also from academics, regular industry vendors and stuff and so on. So it was pretty widely attended workshop, with 3 different phases in there. So first of all, it was really a retrospective into the past, what happened in the past, what worked, didn't work, what's happening currently, and where we want to go. So, and the idea was to get a set of requirements at the end of this to see what work needs to get done, right? So part of it was a complaining session, right? What didn't go well, and then look at what is working well, and look at what needs to get done. And there's a link down there. It talks about you can go see all the position papers, the presentation that happened there, all those things that are available there. And there's also the recordings of the whole workshop itself, so you can go take a look at it. And that's one of the things I kind of want to focus on is we also did an operator survey concurrently with this. So we reached out to, again, the NANOG was one of them, the APNIC thing was another one, and AutoConf, from the first keynote, right? We are also at AutoCon, and kind of put out a QR code for people to do surveys. The network operators do surveys to figure out what people are actually using in the networks. And so the first question we had was what tools do people use for configuration management? And it was pretty surprising, the amount of CLI use in there. So we thought hey, everybody's moved on from CLIs and use network automation pretty widely. So Ansible is probably one of the most used tools, like which is like pretty good because it has potential to do automated stuff underneath. But CLI was like pretty surprising, and I would go into why like people are using CLIs. Like it's a pretty sad situation with the availability of models, but people actually do use CLIs mainly because there's like huge gaps in functionality that's being offered in the models. So once we look past the tools, we also talked about the protocols. So because we asked the operators, because like Ansible can be used with many underlying protocols, and we did see for configuration management, netconf is being pretty widely used. And also surprising is SNMP continues to be relevant here, right? Because like SNMP, we thought like, hey, like this is like this old dinosaur, like has like a bunch of issues, but it's something that people are using pretty commonly for configuration management as well. And you'll also see GNMI. So there's like a gRPC presentation ongoing right now. So the GNMI seems to capture quite a bit of share in people doing things. But as you'll see, there's like quite a bit of overlap between what the GNMI, gRPC, and OpenConfig does, along with the IETF protocols as well. And on the monitoring front, it's pretty clear that Prometheus is like one of the most common tools like people are using. And there's also people building their own in-house tools to like do the monitoring stuff for them. And SNMP obviously is still pretty popular for people to use because like SNMP has like a lot of the devices support SNMP models pretty well. And if you just go look at the protocols underneath, like syslog and SNMP are like pretty popular as the protocols that go in. And GNMI is also starting to get like quite a bit of traction going in there. But SNMP, again, like takes like the biggest share of the protocols that people are using for monitoring. And I think it boils down to what is available for the devices. So this has the most coverage feature-wise, like in the devices, and that kind of what we guess from talking to people as well on top of this. And so this is like kind of like the catch-all bucket. So we did have like, if we didn't have a specific set of tools, we also put in general kind of, hey, any other tools that you use, like Puppet is kind of there, and people are using like pub sub mechanisms, like kind of like Kafka to do it. And so this is really for completeness, like what else do people use and how to go about doing it. And so this is kind of another surprising one, right? Like there's like a pretty high set of people, like probably like about 2/3 of like people believe that like network automation is like very, very important for the organization. And if you go a little bit further, you'd see like a much higher percentage of people actually have the network automated. So like even though there's like 2/3 of people who think network automation is important, about 3/4 of the people say there's like some amount of moderation, automation in the network. So it's kind of hard to reconcile like why this is the case. Are there people who don't want to automate the network who are getting the network automated? It's kind of very difficult to figure out like from the responses to the survey. And another interesting thing is about half the people are starting to use like streaming telemetry. And this kind of goes back to the GNMI stuff, which is like pretty popular for streaming telemetry. And as I said before, we had like 3 sessions, like I think 3-hour sessions that we kind of ran, and like one of them was focused on the past, like it's really a look back at like what happened and the analysis. The second session was looking at the present, like look at the problems and requirements, and the third one where we look at the future, like what are the possible solutions that can be there, and what are the next steps. And at the end of the workshop, we just went to collect some key takeaways. Looked at potential requirements and like how we go about doing the work in the IETF in the next steps. So, so the Jürgen, like who was the author of the original workshop RFC, he talked about like how the past IAB really looked at something that can be declarative, composable, reproducible, and verifiable. And this has always been the holy grail of like what we wanted to do for network management. And so like Ian from DT really talked about how this is actually challenging, right? And one of the things that was like pretty common, it was like across all the people who complained, was that there's no direct connection between open source and standardization. And that's something that like most people who talked about wanted to bring up quite a bit, right? Like, how do we work pretty closely with like, open source NMSs and also like the standardization. I think like, Wim is here, like Wim was talking about some stuff he's doing in CNCF, like with like automation stuff, and kind of how do we bring about getting these two worlds together, right? Like how do we get like implementations in parallel with like standards, or like, can we do standards in a much faster way? All those things were like themes that came up pretty frequently. And another theme that came out was like the solutions that we have. Like we had this whole bunch of requirements and we went about trying to solve all of them and ended up with like something that's pretty complex, right? Like, so if you look at the number of Yang models, the netconf, resconf, like there's like a whole bunch of things that people need to understand to form like a fully working solution. So that complexity has been kind of a big challenge for people to get consistent solutions. And there's also positive news is like people have started using like this same kind of automation stack for IoT kind of devices. So like these things are shown to scale pretty well to large number of devices. So that is like the core conf is like application of the same thing to IoT devices, which are like severely constrained, both power-wise, storage-wise, and like transmission-wise, right? So it's become like a very interesting concept where like people can take this, scale this up to like networks with large number of devices, but also scale this down to devices that are like pretty constrained. And another thing is like we kind of talked about is like open config and Google. So one of the things we kind of notice is that the open config based ecosystem is kind of diverging slowly more and more away from the IETF Yang netconf ecosystem, even though they had pretty much the same base, they had the same kind of goals, and we talked about like how we can go about like making sure that things don't diverge too much, so people don't have to choose and kind of start writing adapters for everything, because like some people will have open config models, some people will have IETF NMDA Yang models. How do we actually minimize the pain for doing divergent implementations? So one of the key issues that was brought up is like the lack of full coverage, right? Like, so the device has like X number of things that can be manipulated or monitored, but like the set of Yang models that vendors provide don't cover all those features. So some of them could be in Yang model, some of them will be in SNMP, some of them can only be done using CLI or screen scraping. So like this makes like the tool set pretty complex, because like Yang doesn't provide like a single Windows service for people to get things to manage all the devices. And so this is like something people say, like, hey, we should focus a little bit more on system level or service models, like rather than just focusing on the device models, because we can actually abstract this complexity underneath the service level models. And there was this comment that like IETF should focus on system level instead of just looking at the APIs, but look at like how all these things are put together, which is not traditionally something the IETF has done. It's really about like protocols everywhere, but I think like there was a need to look at like higher level things. And there's a huge learning curve, which is pretty like associated with the complexity that's in there. And there's like too many options for people to pick from, right? So simply if you look at like netconf, coreconf, and like resconf, and CBOR, or like JSON, or like XML, it really like has a combinatory explosion of things to do. So like how do we actually converge and get like something simpler? And so if you look at it, the complexity keeps coming back, right? Like into the stuff, and there's like some operators like really talked about like how monitoring is pretty important, and like so there should be ability to validate the configuration once it's like sent in, and there should be a focus on observability that needs to happen. And so one of the things that was brought up was like Yang push. So Yang push is kind of like proceeding as like a semi-independent initiative, like under the auspices of the IETF, but there's also like things to simplify it. There's like Yang push Lite that people are talking about that tries to focus things onto a smaller subset of things that people can actually implement. So as I said before, the complexity of multiple models makes things really difficult to implement, and since there's multiple models that are developed in parallel and they're both complex, the mapping also becomes very, very difficult. And we don't really have an intent-based system for like doing configuration, but I think there's a need for that. And another key thing is to kind of associate always with an open source implementation to do the interop and the compliance tests at the same time as protocols. And this is something OpenConfig has done pretty well. There's always the implementation that goes along with the models that come in. So it makes it really easy to innovate in one way. And also the other important thing is things that are not necessary, nobody implements them and they kind of get thrown away. So that's something the IETF has hey, we should do a model that does all these things, but not really focusing on the most important things. So the idea would be to more focus on things that people need. So if I can be blunt, is unless you have an implementation or a need for it, it doesn't get developed, right? That's kind of the model that some people are proposing to move forward, to kind of associate the use of something with the presence of an implementation, and then it gets into the standard. And there's some future-looking stuff, there's people who've been involved in this. They talked about knowledge graphs and kind of focusing more on RESTCON, because people are very used to API-based solutions, and RESTCON provides a very API-based solution. And again, the general thing is minimize the complexity, focus on timely solutions. So don't do a much more complete model that's going to arrive months late or years late. But rather focus on things that are important right now, and focus on doing implementations and make sure things are available quickly. And one of the things that has kind of been a thorn in the side of the OpenConfig IETF debate is the NMDA. So there's still a lot of this lingering thing that NMDA is technically superior, right? But it has issues on implementation on some of the devices. So that's kind of where it went nowhere with the OpenConfig models, and this has been brought up multiple times. There's no clear way to see how this is actually going to move forward. Do we how do we make sure that the good concepts in NMDA are kind of continued going forward? And we also talked about how some of the Google people came to the IETF, try to take the GNMI and try to push it forward, and how it kind of gets along with the technical purity of the NMDA, right? And how do we kind of do this right balance between technical excellence and also practicality, right? That's something we have to do. And one other thing that was brought up was that the IETF process of doing RFCs. So the RFCs are really made for interop and stability and being there forever or for a really long time. And this doesn't make things easy to iterate. So if every time we have to revise an RFC, it takes years to do something. So can we do a process where we can do something much quicker? And no pun intended, we did do this with Quick, right? Google came into the IETF with the base of what became Quick, and we were iterating pretty quickly, and the drafts are getting implemented by people. So we would go through a bunch of drafts, and then flag some draft as ready for implementation, then everybody goes and implements it, and then it's still a draft version, still not an RFC. People could still do interop and do testing and stuff and so on. So is this something we want to emulate? So the Mahesh, who's here at the meeting today, has decided to look at this thing in the IETF ops and management area. Warren is another AD in that area. He's not the Yang AD, but so we have this group called ops and management. So they're kind of, even though it's the same area, people have different responsibilities. Warren is focused on the ops side, and Mahesh is focused on the management side, right? And the idea is to see if we can do a better mechanism of iterating really, really quickly and to come up with things that are ready to implement, and have the open source stuff work at the same time as the standardization process. And so looking at the ecosystem, I think one of the key takeaways is the ease of use is simply not there, right? So we do have a lot of complete solutions, but it's not easy to use for anybody. And in this case, the tools matter a bit more than protocols. So it doesn't matter if there's a whole set of protocols with the features. If a tool doesn't pick the right subset of things and implement things in an easy-to-use manner, it's not going to get done, right? And the ecosystem is still fragmented. SNMP is still in use, and CLI seems to be the fallback for most network engineers, because it provides the absolute access to the device, right? Which others, because the coverage is a bit lacking. And one example is if you look at how the V4 to V6 transition happened or is happening, it took forever, right? It's because it is challenging, right? For getting rid of something that's working pretty decently to go with something that is certainly better, but it has like quite a bit of differences from the models you're used to. And I think like we kind of had to learn from it and see how to make this transition simpler. And we still had to figure out like how this like GNMI and the model in which it works is going to get integrated into the ecosystem. But the positive news is like the model-driven network management is generally a success. Like it's not like nobody ever like came in the survey or in the presentations or like anywhere and said like, hey, we don't want to do model-driven management. So it's just a question of like, what specific model people are using or like, what thing is missing, right? And the documentation is pretty bad. So there's like efforts to kind of start documenting like how the models relate to each other and so on, but we are quite a bit away from it because it's not something anybody has focused on. But I think there should be some deployment guides and educational stuff that needs to happen around this. And as I talked earlier, the lack of open source tools is like a huge barrier to adoption. I work for Cisco, and like the NSO is like a very popular stuff for our clients, but there's also other people who kind of like hand roll their own tools. That kind of makes it difficult to keep up with the large number of new models that come up, right? And for the protocol, we do know like from the survey and how people talking, like NetConf has been very successful in the configuration part of network management, but it's like really not there for monitoring. So people are still like falling back to something else to monitoring. And as I said before, the CLI and screen scraping like exists because the models don't cover the whole set of things somebody needs to do. And people are still doing polling-based things, which is not good for the network, but people do it because like, there's no easy way to really like do the notifications in a consistent manner. And on the modeling side, the models are pretty complex. So Yang is not like really complex, right? So if you look at it, it's easy to like know Yang, but like the people build models that are pretty complex to get all the features that are possible. So there's like a big trade-off to be made between coverage of like everything that you want to do and simplicity. So there's more service level modeling that's required. Device level modeling needs to be a block, but people need to expose services using the models, and that makes life easier. So you can still have everything being able to be configured, but also be able to do like higher level abstractions out there. And configuration needs to be verifiable, and multi-vendor compatibility is like a major pain because like every vendor has their own proprietary models, and it makes like difficult to map between them in a heterogeneous network. And so people were really thinking of like some kind of translation adapters, like to build some kind of northbound API, which will be sitting outside. This could be a controller or like another separate mapping layer that's going to be off device to make sure that like a heterogeneous network can be supported. And on the standard side, as I said before, we need to have rapid model development. So like taking months or years to do things, because IETF is really like meeting driven, even though like everything happens on mailing lists. Like most humans, like it's deadline driven. So people try to do like, big pushes like 3 times a year rather than like, every week. So I think there's like a need to kind of do stuff much faster in collaboration with like having an open source implementation in there. And look at scalability as like a key factor, like, how do you scale both up and down, and also to reduce the complexity of the models. And one thing we kind of talked about is like, how do we actually do an experiment in the IETF, like with like slightly different procedures where we can do something like much quicker and have, it's similar to what like we did with Quake to see if we can kind of have implementable stuff much before there's an RFC. And Warren is laughing because Warren did have proposals called living documents, which go for this, but we will see if you're able to do some experiment on this like pretty quickly. And what's next? So the IAB workshop is really a spark for in-depth discussions, is really like a starting point, not like a destination. There will be a workshop report that will kind of get published as an RFC. There's an initial draft out. It came out after the slide deadline for NANOG, so the link is not here, but like I'll try to see if I can submit the workshop report link as well. And please continue to participate in the IETF like at any forum. So I think our goal is to continue the engagement with the operator forums. Like, it's something that has not happened consistently over the past like 10 or so years, but with Warren, like there's like a lot of participation that's common, and InGen as well. There's like a lot of consistent participation within the body, so we kind of want to keep in touch and keep getting feedback and input from people on how we go about doing things. And so hey Ignas, hey. So the feedback is welcome on the outcome of the workshop. So just look at the materials, like tell us like whatever. There's like a mailing list. You can like subscribe to, get input, like provide input, take like learnings, and everything is there. So the committee is working on the workshop report. Like the 0.0 version is out, but it's going to probably get into an RFC in the next couple of months. And just a reminder, the workshop is not the end. It's the beginning of the work. And the NMOP working group that's going to meet in Bangkok in March, it's going to start discussing some of these things. And like, please, everybody's welcome to participate either in person or online or on the mailing list. So please, you're welcome to participate. Thanks. That's it. And thank you. Thanks for your time. And love to hear questions. And Warren, if you can come hang out here as well.
Come on, there must be some questions. Jeff, you can always come up with something.
I don't have a question, but maybe. Wim Hendricks from Nokia. It's not really a question, but an observation, right? Because I've been building some tools to do like multi-vendor Yang, but using the device models. One observation that I have is that I actually found issues still today in Yang models of vendors. And the problem that, I'm also a vendor, so that's probably a challenge. But so what you see is that the model is correct, but when you use it with data, it fails. So the problem is even, so like we have tools like PyYang and GoYang, and they do schema validations, and it's fine. But if you test with data, you actually see that like, and where the typical problem is, like in must statements, they see that they don't use the proper paths and stuff like that, right? So it's actually not, so it shows two things. One is they are not used, in my view. Second is we don't have a good way to test those type of things, right? Or they might probably work with the vendor tooling, but if you use them with other tooling, they don't use. So it's another observation that probably was not highlighted properly, so I wanted to share. But that's, so first of all, as a vendor, I have a challenge how to fix that. Now, the good thing in Yang is you can write your own deviations. So that's what we do, right? So we basically augment the schema with our deviations, so which we write ourselves, so we can proceed, but the issue is not fixed. Ideally, it would be fixed at the origin, right? But what you see, sometimes we report issues even to other vendors. They don't have any, let's say, motivation to fix them.
Do you think there's a missing forum, Wim, like that people can talk about this?
Yeah,
like,
that's why I'm bringing it up here. Is like there seems to be like a missing link. So the challenge that I see in general, and that's also not a problem. It's not the IETF itself. In IETF, you build standards necessarily, right? And at the moment, I think in some working groups, we have this thing like, unless you show two interoperable things, right, you can proceed, right? We haven't done that in this space so far as I understand. So, but that's passé, right? So that's, you cannot change it. So, but you see that there is so the challenge is two things, right? It's like, there is a missing piece of validating and testing and doing that. And then there is a second missing piece is basically the tooling around it, right? Which is not an IETF problem necessarily, but it's a problem for the standard, for, let's say, the solution. Yeah. And how to, so that's where I wanted to have some debate on how do we fix this, because I think Yang as such is a great protocol, but because of the other things, we have the challenges. So it's like,
yeah, I mean,
yin and yang.
It seems like it would be nice if we had like a couple of nice test benches set up.
I mean, I see all the stuff that I'm doing is open source, so I can share with you what actually, it is shared. Actually, the fixes that we have on the Yang model, they are public.
Yeah. But I mean, it seems like there should be a test bench where people can submit their models and it gets run through a bunch of different implementations, hopefully with a bunch of different vendors as well behind. Yeah. So if you have a new model that does foo, you can make sure that a bunch of different tooling will be able to consume it. And if you expect it to configure an interface, you have a bunch of different devices that you can push it through and make sure that they actually follow. Again, that's obviously like a wildly contrived example, but something so that you can actually have a legitimate way to test the models other than just, is it syntactically valid, but is it also, does it make sense?
Correct. I mean, that's what we do. So at the moment, we have those tools. The problem is that, so it's vendor specific. So at the moment, we are focused on vendor specific data. So that means that you need to get the configurations of each of these vendors validated. Now, the good thing is what we did recently is we took running config of all the vendors and we ran that as a base. But of course, it depends what's in the running config to see whether it's complete or not, right? But of course, one thing that could help us is basically if you have configs that we want to validate, I'm happy to put them in our testbed because it's just CI pipeline. We spin up through Container Lab, we spin up the NOSes and we can validate. So that's so the effort for us to do so is not so huge.
What about the data itself, Wim? Is the data itself like there? Because I remember like, a lot of the old RFCs, right? Like say MD5, right? Like it actually had the test vectors like embedded in the RFCs, right? Obviously, this is not something that's going to scale. But I think if you have the tools, like which you said are open source, like what is the data that somebody can use to reproduce that, right?
For example, I mean, I took running config, but for example, I don't have the running config of all the different vendors. And so like some people have data centers, so it's EVPN with VXLAN. Some people have SRP6, some people have these protocols. So it's basically all the variations of all the different things on how you can use the system is what is missing. And of course, I can build it, but it would be good to get it as an input from various people such that we can
Well, you said that people could send you their configs and you could put it through your CI pipeline.
Correct, yeah.
What would be cool is if you had a way that people could just submit their configs into a tool, like pretty web interface or something, and it would run it through the CI pipeline.
I can make it better to do these type of things, yes.
If people, people actually
sure.
want
And it's not a big deal or not a big issue to do so, because I think we help each other somehow, right? So that's one thing, and then, I mean, that's my observation at the moment. It's like we have to solve this as a community somehow, right? Because IETF is on one hand can do one thing, but on the other hand, I think the more people who can help and help us move forward.
And I think that some of what, you use the word community, and I think that that's a large part of it. We don't really feel, or at least to me, it doesn't feel like we have at the moment a reasonably strong community of people who are all doing this and helping each other out. We have OpenConfig, we have the NetConf people, we have some set of vendors, we have some set of people who are like, this doesn't work for me. And having a community where everybody wants to help each other feels like it would be a very good
We have too many fragmented pieces, right? Because even in, for example, in OpenConfig, the issue that we have right now, OpenConfig is Yang 1.0. So we have submitted a few PRs to make it 1.1 compliant, but also they don't get accepted because it changes the base of what OpenConfig is based upon. So there is challenges all over the place.
And Wim, like, is this something that you brought up in NMOP or somewhere? Like, are you willing to bring it up? I think it'll be good to at least put out a call for action, probably to pull a side meeting to figure out things.
I want to help us move forward and make progress. That's basically.
But somebody needs to lead to push stuff forward, right? So if you're willing to put it up, that'll be like really cool. At least like get a slot.
I mean, like the PRs on OpenConfig. I mean, they are open. I mean, we submitted them.
No, but like put out this like a small call for action at NMOP to say like, hey, like people who are interested, you have like your models, like can we sit down and talk somewhere, right? Like at least to get like one part kicked off, right? At least like on the IETF NetConf Yang side, like to see if there's some interest in like kind of working together, because I know like most people who have to fix those bugs or prioritize those bugs in vendor models are probably going to be there, right? Like I think it'll be good too.
Yeah, correct. So that, I mean, and of course it's always a priority of the vendor to push that into their queue and stuff like that. So it's and of course it's always hard as a vendor to push another vendor. Although I'm looking at this not from a vendor perspective, I'm looking from this as a community to help us make this work go better. So.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. So Mahesh, like since you're just joining, just to summarize Wim's stuff. So Wim is doing like multi-vendor model validation and like issues in vendor models. So he's trying to flag them to vendors, but he doesn't have a good forum to do it. So I asked him to kind of come to NMOP and at least like talk about this as like an issue, right? So.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. So I did reach out to, I think on Slack, Wim, if you would see my response. I think in general for any of those tooling and collaboration work, NMOP would be the working group that we can certainly talk and get you some time in the working group for that.
Thanks, Mahesh. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
All right. Randy is in Cisco. Okay. I promise my question will be brief. What we're seeing is from our web customers, right? They like to have more modular, codified messages in terms of the troubleshooting. For example, we know syslog messages are unstructured. What I like to do is to be able to consume it by machines so that the messages can convert into codified structured messages, right? Like a YAML file instead of just a text file. So first of all, I'd like to ask, right, if you see that is something that IETA can do to standardize that, for example, standardize the troubleshooting of individual syslog messages, break into, for example, here's the symptom, here's the cause, here's the troubleshooting in a standardized way. Right now, different customers are doing their own way, right? First of all, do you see there's a need for that? And secondly, if there's a need, I think there's something could be done to collaborate and make it some kind of standard.
Yeah, so when you say standardized, I would probably think not, right? Like because the IETF doesn't have the governance for syslog, right? So we have like documentation of like the formats, but not like the change control, right? Like so IETF cannot say, hey, this is how syslog message should look like. So like we have a kind of continuum of RFC, some of them which document existing practice, and I think we do have that for syslog. But I don't think there's any place which says like, hey, this is how the syslog message is going to look like in the future, right?
I mean, there's a structured syslog RFC.
Correct.
But I mean, that just has things like, you know,
These are the fields that are going to
severity
be.
and field like that. But there's
I
nothing
think
at
that's
the
not
level
what
of-
I'm asking. I'm not saying that syslog message has to be this way. I'm saying given a syslog message, how can we dissect the messages into different fields? For example, here's the symptom of the syslog message. Here's the root cause of the syslog message. Here's how would you troubleshoot to resolve syslog messages. If we have that kind of format, consistent format across the vendors, then you can plug into that into an automation framework that can pick it up. So if I got a syslog symptom, then here's how I do it. Here's what the symptom means, right? The exact message could vary, but the format can be consistent across the vendors.
So are you also referring to the idea of how to correlate data, whether it's coming from syslog or other events?
Could be, potentially, could be if they go across syslog. Right now, I'm just using syslog as an example.
As an example, right?
Right.
So yes, there is one piece of work I will, we can offline, I can try to show you. I don't know whether it's happening in NMOP or I think NetConf, but one of the working groups has a discussion on correlation of events.
Okay.
I don't know if that's the area of interest for you or not.
For sure, eventually. I'm mostly right now at the point is just within syslog, as an example, it's a very unstructured message, right? If I can chop it up into here's the symptom of that message,
Okay.
and here's the potential root cause of the message, here's how you troubleshoot those messages.
And, yeah, and I mean, I started saying, you know, there's the structured syslog format, and it seems like all you need to do is have a little bit more information in that so you can specify
Make
within
it
the
more
payload.
structured.
Yeah, within the payload,
Right.
a structured field of, you know, a couple of enumerations of this might be where you want to look. So that seems like a relatively easy thing to suggest, right? It's basically just a convention.
It's
So-
definitely doable.
Yeah.
It just make it consistent across the equipment, across all the vendors, so that as a consumer of that message, you can plug it readily into an AI system, can pick it up. I see this symptom. Here's potential solutions to that symptom. Here's how I would correct that symptom, right? A lot of this can be standardized.
Yeah, and I mean, it's defining this sort of syntax of that seems like it should be fairly trivial. So if you want to propose something,
I mean, each
right.
vendor of that syslog message
Yep.
can propose that, right? But the format is going to be
Yep, that's
across
okay.
the
The format-
vendors.
the format
All the
is-
vendors can have that same format.
Sounds good. Thanks, Randy. Like we would love to talk offline after this, like to
Thank you.
talk
sir.
further. Thank you. Thanks. Ingen, thanks.
Yes. For the syslog thing, I think for most of our protocol RFCs, we have the specification say when you see this error, you should log some sort of alarm. But
Correct.
since it's a should, I don't think all the vendors may not implement all of
100%.
those.
Some will, some
Anyway,
won't.
so this is from the previous talk. So for the NEMOPS workshop, I'm very happy to see you guys gonna do some process work for how the young models are gonna be published. Right now we have the problem. Let's say you publish a model, finally you have an RFC, and then later somebody do an implementation, find a small error. To me, models more like software instead of a specification or regular how the OSPF is designed. So it might be just a simple error, but for the IETF process, we have to do a base version. You guys know very well how long that's gonna cost.
Yep.
And it might be a small error, say the scope of integer should start from 1 instead of starting from 0.
Yep.
But for that base version, when we look at it, never mind. I'll just wait.
So there's sort of, should I do?
Yeah,
There's sort
go
of
for
two parts to that. One of those is Mahesh's predecessor, Benoit, was working on semantic versioning for Yang stuff or models. So basically, small updates would just be point whatever revisions. So you could do easy, at least then that way you could tell which was the correct model and what the version was. But I think also there's been some talk of just sticking models in GitHub and sort of blessing a specific set of commits, and then it's relatively easy to make changes and have sort of deviations from that. But there's also been some discussion on having a different type of publication for things like models and code, because if you just want to change something like a 32-bit integer to a 64-bit integer, that doesn't necessarily require an entire whole FAF. That might have been a bad example, but yeah.
Yeah.
Living documents was, don't get me started on living documents or I'll spend 45
I think
minutes
we
on it.
desperately need that process to be
Right,
changed.
so there is also an experiment that is underway right now that I've asked a couple of authors of Yang models to do is to run this through GitHub, not update the whole draft. So that experiment might catch these smaller errors and revisions faster.
So as a model contributor, we do have all our models development done in GitHub, but it's sort of like although it's public, but most likely only the collaborators know about it. So I don't mind publish this information somewhere. See, if you want to look at the latest, you can always go there.
But you need something more than just the authors uploaded a new version, here's a commit. You need
And actual
people
announcement.
uploaded a new version, and some set of people in the working group are like, that seems mostly reasonable. So you need a different type of consensus call versus publishing a whole new RFC. You need something that's somebody else has looked at this. So
I think we should sort of mimic how we do software development, right?
Right.
You do some coding and you have some code reviewers look at your code and say,
Yep.
good
Right.
to go. Yeah.
Right, and also I think Wim brought it up as well, right? Like can we ask for implementations like for this to actually get in, right, into the next state, right? Like that there is an implementation, there's more than one implementation that interoperates. That's the level of thing that probably Mahesh should look at to figure out how do we do this, right? Because in routing it's kind of worked pretty well in IDR, right, to have this multi-implementation stuff, right? So how
The
can we
thing
do it?
is, we sort of have a chicken egg issue there. The BGP model is not an RFC yet, so it's waiting for implementation. And then some vendor may say, "Oh, it's not an RFC yet. I'll just wait."
Yep.
So,
Yep.
but if we have sort of other process to say, although it's not an official RFC yet, we are done with the model work. Good to
Living documents.
implement it. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Nisha. Thank you. Thanks.
Last question.
Steve Ulrich, individual. I went through the readout on the NEMOP workshop, considerable depth. And I mean, kudos on a most IETF response to an IETF problem.
I don't know if it's positive or negative, but yeah, go ahead.
It's both. If you look at the agenda for the NANOG this week, and if you look at the results of the survey that you did in the introspection, I'd note that there is a paucity of IETF-driven, management interfaces, anything that resembles, any effective community around the IETF initiatives here. And yet, the conclusions from the workshop seem to have been to double down on kind of an IETF mode of operation. A recommendation to pursue RESTconf or Yang Push Lite or, and I'm curious in the interests of community, having participated at some length in the OpenConfig community, what there would be in terms of kind of mending or creating bridges or looking to unify and drive more IETF relevance into this space, because by your own surveys and by what I would call the agenda of conferences going forward, there's increasingly little relevance.
Right.
So like how would you bring somebody who's lost faith in the IETF process back into the fold?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And to answer your question first, right? Like, yes, there is the reason. Like, the reason we are kind of doing this thing is to kind of mend the fences. And so there's two things. Like, first of all, we're not very relevant in the mind share, right? It's because people are looking at the tools that are getting used. And if you go one level down, you still see some IETF protocol used, right? Except that people don't care that it's an IETF protocol getting used. So, and I think the bigger issue is the complexity and lack of coverage, which is the kind of two things that are.
There's no ecosystem, right?
Right. So, and I think there is some introspection to do, and we are doing it right now, but really the goal is to kind of be in lockstep with the operator bodies to kind of make sure that we continuously listen to it instead of once every 20 years. I think that was the conclusion from last time. It took hey, 20 years, we asked you 20 years ago what your problems were. Hey, and we solved them, look. But the world has moved on. And I think the idea is to kind of keep the closer relationship, like you said.
The world is diverging. I think, the agenda for this week shows a huge divergence. Scott's talk shows divergence. Your survey shows divergence. I look forward to seeing what happens.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks. Ingchen, last.
That means we need to come back to NANOG more often. Yeah.
Absolutely. That is the intent. So thank you very much. Thanks all for coming. And please keep in touch over email, participate in all the meetings, and we'll be here as well. So thank you very much.